The Arizona sun beat mercilessly on the dusty trail leading to Copper Canyon Ranch as Sarah McKenna guided her chestnut mare through the scattered mesquite bushes. The July heat shimmered off the red rocks, creating dancing mirages that played tricks on tired eyes. She'd been checking the eastern fence line since dawn, inspecting the barbed wire for breaks where cattle might wander into Apache territory. The work was necessary but dangerous. This stretch of land had seen too much blood in recent years. Her husband Thomas had been killed on this very trail 2 summers ago, caught in a raid that left 3 ranchers dead and their livestock scattered. The memory still cut deep, but Sarah had refused to abandon the ranch they'd built together. At 27, she was young to be running a spread this size alone, but the McKenna name still carried weight in these parts, and her hired hands respected her determination. A cavalry patrol emerged from behind a boulder outcropping, their blue uniforms dark with sweat and dust. Captain Morrison led the group, his weathered face grim as he raised his hand in greeting. Behind the soldiers, a figure slumped over a horse's neck, wrists bound with rope, blood staining his buckskin shirt and dripping steadily onto the ground below. "Mrs. McKenna," Morrison called out, his voice carrying the weight of military authority mixed with exhaustion. "We've got ourselves a prize here. Caught this Apache raider near Willow Creek at first light. He put up quite a fight before we brought him down." Sarah's breath caught as she studied the prisoner. Even wounded and bound, there was something magnificent about him. His long black hair hung loose around his shoulders, matted with blood and dust, but still gleaming in the harsh sunlight. Despite the obvious pain etched across his bronzed features, his posture spoke of unbroken pride. He couldn't have been much older than her own 27 years, but his dark eyes held depths that spoke of battles fought and losses endured. "He's hurt badly, Captain," Sarah observed, noting the way the man swayed dangerously in his bonds. A dark stain spread across his left side where a bullet had torn through muscle and sinew. "Good thing, too," Morrison spat, adjusting his hat against the glaring sun. "This one's got a reputation throughout the territory. They call him Aiakos, means eagle soaring in their heathen tongue. He's been leading raids from here to Tucson, hitting supply wagons and isolated homesteads. Cost us 3 good men just bringing him in alive." The Apache warrior's head lifted slightly at the mention of his name, and for a moment his eyes met Sarah's directly. There was no pleading there, no fear of the death that surely awaited him, only a quiet dignity that made her heart skip unexpectedly. She'd seen that look before in her own mirror during the darkest days after Thomas's death, the look of someone who'd lost everything but refused to surrender their soul. "What are you planning to do with him?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer from the coiled rope hanging from Morrison's saddle horn. Morrison's expression hardened like granite. "There's a suitable cottonwood tree about a mile back. We'll make it quick and be done with this business. Can't have Apaches thinking they can raid white settlements with impunity. Everyone we string up sends a message to the rest." "Wait." The word escaped Sarah's lips before she could stop it. Every reasonable part of her mind screamed warnings about the folly of what she was contemplating, but something deeper, something that recognized the fundamental humanity in the wounded man's stoic bearing, made her step her horse forward between the prisoner and the patrol. "I'll take responsibility for him." The silence that followed stretched like a taut wire, broken only by the restless stamping of horses, the creak of leather saddles, and the distant cry of a red-tailed hawk circling overhead in the endless blue sky. Morrison stared at her as if she declared her intention to sprout wings and fly, while his dust-covered men exchanged incredulous glances that spoke volumes about their opinion of her sanity. "Ma'am, with all due respect to your late husband's memory, this isn't some injured coyote you can nurse back to health in your barn," Morrison said slowly, his voice taking on the patronizing tone men used when they thought women were being foolishly emotional. "This is a killer, an Apache warrior who's taken white lives, burned white homes, stolen white children. The blood of innocent folks is on his hands." "He's also bleeding to death," Sarah replied firmly, her green eyes flashing with the same determination that had kept her ranch running after Thomas's funeral. "Look at him, Captain. He can barely sit his horse. What threat could he possibly be now?" Morrison shook his head grimly. "Your risk, ma'am. That Apache's a beast." Sarah looked again at the wounded warrior, seeing past the blood and war paint to the man beneath, seeing the way he held himself despite crushing pain, the intelligence that flickered behind his dark eyes, the strength that even grievous wounds couldn't break. "Beast," she said quietly, her voice carrying across the desert air with surprising strength and conviction that surprised even herself. "He's my future." The ride back to Copper Canyon Ranch passed in tense silence, with Morrison's men flanking Sarah and her unexpected charge like an armed escort. The wounded Apache warrior swayed dangerously in his saddle, his breathing growing more labored with each mile. Sarah found herself stealing glances at him, noting how he fought to remain upright despite the blood loss that was slowly draining the color from his bronzed skin. "You're making a mistake that'll get you killed, Mrs. McKenna," Morrison warned as they approached the ranch gates. "Mark my words, the moment that savage gets his strength back, he'll slit your throat and burn this place to the ground." Sarah's jaw tightened. "Then that's my choice to make, Captain. I'll sign whatever papers you need, but he stays here." The ranch sprawled across a natural basin surrounded by red rock formations, its adobe buildings clustered around a central courtyard where a windmill creaked steadily in the desert breeze. Sarah had chosen the location carefully with Thomas, defensible, with good water and grazing land that stretched to the horizon. Now it would serve as both sanctuary and prison for the man who might once have tried to destroy it. Her foreman, Jake Patterson, emerged from the barn as the unusual procession approached. A grizzled man in his 50s who'd worked cattle drives from Texas to Montana, Jake's weathered face showed immediate alarm when he saw the Apache warrior. "Mrs. Sarah, what in the Sam Hill are you doing?" Jake demanded, his hand moving instinctively to the Colt at his hip. "That's an Apache brave, and he looks meaner than a rattlesnake even half dead." "Help me get him down, Jake," Sarah ordered, dismounting quickly. "We need to get him inside before he bleeds out completely." Morrison supervised as his men untied the prisoner, who immediately collapsed to his knees in the dust, his strength finally giving out. For the first time, Sarah saw vulnerability in his dark eyes. Not fear, but the recognition that his body was betraying him. She knelt beside him, ignoring the shocked gasps from her ranch hands who had gathered to witness this unprecedented scene. "Can you understand English?" she asked softly. The warrior's eyes focused on her with effort, and he gave an almost imperceptible nod. "I'm going to help you. Do you understand that too?" His lips moved, but no sound emerged. The effort seemed to cost him dearly, and he swayed even while kneeling. Sarah made her decision quickly, knowing that every moment of delay brought him closer to death. "Jake, Tom, help me carry him to the spare room in the house," she commanded. "And send Miguel to town for Dr. Hartwell. Tell him it's an emergency." "Sarah, you can't bring an Apache into your home," Jake protested, using her first name in his agitation. "It ain't right, and it ain't safe." "He can barely lift his head, Jake. What harm can he do?" Sarah shot back. "Besides, it's my house and my decision." Morrison handed her an official document. "This absolves the U.S. Army of any responsibility for what happens next, Mrs. McKenna. You're harboring a known hostile at your own risk. When he kills you, and he will, don't expect us to come running to investigate." After the cavalry departed in a cloud of dust and disapproval, Sarah found herself alone with her ranch hands, and an unconscious Apache warrior stretched out on her spare bed. The room that had once housed visitors now held a man who represented everything her community feared and hated. Dr. Hartwell arrived just after sunset, a thin man with kind eyes who'd been tending to frontier ailments for 30 years. He took one look at his patient and shook his head grimly. "Sarah, this man has lost a dangerous amount of blood. The bullet went clean through, but it nicked something important. Even if he lives through the night, infection could still kill him." The doctor paused, studying her face in the lamplight. "Are you certain about this? There are folks in town who won't understand." "I'm certain," Sarah replied, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. "What does he need?" For 3 days, Sarah maintained a vigil beside the Apache's bed, changing bandages, spooning broth between his lips during his lucid moments, and fighting the fever that made him delirious. In his fevered state, he spoke in his native tongue, sometimes urgent and angry, other times soft and mournful. She began to recognize patterns in the foreign words, though their meaning remained a mystery. On the 4th morning, she entered the room to find him awake, and watching her with clear, intelligent eyes. The fever had broken during the night, leaving him weak but alert. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other across the cultural chasm that separated their worlds. "Why?" The word emerged as barely more than a whisper, but it carried the weight of genuine confusion. His English was accented, but clear. Sarah set down the water basin she'd been carrying and met his gaze directly. "Because letting you die would have made me no better than those who killed my husband." Something flickered in his dark eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or the first hint of respect. "Your husband, Apache, killed him?" "Yes," she admitted quietly. 2 years ago, on the Eastern Trail. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the implications of her admission. Here she was, caring for a man whose people had made her a widow, while he lay helpless in the home of his enemies. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. "I am called Aiakos," he said finally, his voice growing stronger. "Eagle soaring, and you are the woman who defied soldiers to save Apache warrior." "I'm Sarah McKenna," she replied, "and I'm beginning to think I may have saved us both." As the days passed, Aiakos grew stronger, though his recovery was complicated by the suspicious glances and whispered concerns of Sarah's ranch hands. Jake Patterson made no secret of his disapproval, checking and rechecking the locks on the spare room door and positioning armed men throughout the ranch buildings. The tension was palpable, like the charged air before a desert thunderstorm. Sarah found herself spending more time in the sick room than anywhere else, drawn by a curiosity she couldn't quite name. During his waking hours, Aiakos observed everything with sharp intelligence, the way sunlight filtered through the cotton curtains, the sounds of ranch life beyond the walls, and most intently, Sarah herself as she changed his bandages or brought him meals. "Your hands," he said one afternoon as she cleaned his wound with practiced efficiency. "They are gentle but strong, hands that have known hard work." Sarah paused in her ministrations, surprised by the observation. "Ranch life doesn't leave room for soft hands," she replied. "I've birthed calves, mended fences, and shot rattlesnakes. Thomas always said I had the hands of a true frontier woman." "Thomas, your dead husband." It wasn't a question, but a statement made with careful neutrality. "He taught you to shoot?" "Among other things," Sarah admitted, resuming her work on his bandages. "He said a woman alone on the frontier needed to know how to defend herself. Looks like he was right, though not in the way he expected." Aiakos studied her profile as she worked, noting the determined set of her jaw and the way her auburn hair caught the afternoon light. "In my tribe, women also learned to fight. My sister could shoot arrows faster than most warriors could draw their bows. She died defending our village when the soldiers came." The quiet pain in his voice made Sarah look up, meeting his dark eyes directly. "I'm sorry for your loss. Losing family, it changes everything." "Yes," he agreed softly. "It makes enemies of those who should be allies, and sometimes allies of those who should be enemies." Their conversations grew longer as his strength returned. Sarah learned that Aiakos spoke 3 languages fluently and could read English better than many of the cowboys in her employ. He told her about his childhood in the Chiricahua Mountains, about learning to track deer through snow-covered pine forests, and the ancient stories his grandmother had shared around winter fires. In return, she spoke of her journey from Missouri to Arizona, of the dreams she and Thomas had shared, and the loneliness that had followed his death. "You could have remarried," Aiakos observed during one of their evening talks. "A woman like you with land and cattle, many men would have asked." Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Many did ask. Most wanted the ranch more than they wanted me. The few who seemed genuine couldn't accept that I intended to keep running this place myself. They expected a wife, not a partner." "And now you care for Apache warrior who can never be either," he said with quiet understanding. The words hung in the air between them, acknowledging a truth that neither had dared speak aloud. Something was growing between them, a connection that transcended the racial hatred and cultural divisions that surrounded them. It was dangerous and impossible, yet undeniable. On his 10th day at the ranch, Aiakos was strong enough to sit up for extended periods. Sarah had moved a chair beside his bed, and they spent the evening hours talking, while oil lamps cast dancing shadows on the adobe walls. Outside, coyotes called to each other across the desert, their voices rising and falling like ancient songs. "Tell me about your name," Sarah requested, settling into her chair with a cup of coffee. "Aiakos, eagle soaring. How did you earn it?" His face grew thoughtful, and for a moment she thought he might not answer. Then he began to speak, his voice taking on the cadence of a storyteller. "When I was 16, hunting season came early, because winter was harsh. Many of our people were hungry, and the young men were expected to bring back meat. I had been tracking an elk for 3 days through snow so deep it reached my waist. On the 3rd day I followed the elk to a cliff overlooking a deep canyon." Sarah leaned forward, drawn into the story despite herself. "The elk was wounded, tired but still dangerous. As I drew my bow, I stepped on loose rock and began to fall. The cliff was 50 feet high with sharp rocks below, but as I fell, I grabbed hold of a young pine tree growing from the cliff face. For 2 hours I hung there, too far down to climb back up, too high to drop safely." "What did you do?" Sarah asked, genuinely captivated. "I watched the eagles," Aiakos replied with a slight smile. There was a nest on a ledge nearby, and I studied how they moved through the air, how they used the wind currents. When my strength was almost gone, I let go and tried to move like an eagle, not fighting the fall, but using it. I landed in a deep snowdrift and walked away with only bruises. And the elk? I tracked it for another day and brought it home to feed my family. The tribal elders said any warrior who could learn from eagles while hanging from a cliff had earned the right to carry their name. His expression grew more serious. But now, I am eagle with broken wings, dependent on enemies for survival. Sarah reached out without thinking, covering his hand with hers. The contact sent an unexpected shock through both of them, not of fear or revulsion, but of something deeper and more complicated. Not enemies, she said quietly, her green eyes meeting his dark ones. Not anymore. The admission changed everything between them. In that moment, both acknowledged that their careful dance around growing feelings had reached its inevitable conclusion. They were no longer captor and prisoner, white woman and Apache warrior, representatives of opposing cultures locked in bloody conflict. They were simply Sarah and Aiakos, two wounded souls who had found something precious and unexpected in each other. "This is madness," Sarah whispered, but she didn't pull her hand away. "Yes," Aiakos agreed, his fingers intertwining with hers, "but perhaps the best kind of madness, the kind that makes broken hearts whole again." Outside, the desert wind carried the scent of sage and mesquite, and somewhere in the distance, an eagle cried out as it soared through the star-filled Arizona sky. Word of Sarah's unusual house guest spread through the territory like wildfire across dry grass. By the third week of August, unwelcome visitors began arriving at Copper Canyon Ranch with increasing frequency. The first was Reverend Matthias from town, a stern man with biblical convictions about the natural order of races. He spent an hour lecturing Sarah about Christian duty and the dangers of showing mercy to heathens, leaving only when she politely but firmly escorted him to the gate. More troubling was the visit from Bill Henderson and 3 other ranchers, men who'd known Thomas and considered themselves Sarah's protectors in his absence. They arrived armed and angry, demanding to inspect her prisoner and voicing dark suspicions about her motivations. "This ain't right, Sarah," Henderson declared, his weathered face flushed with indignation. "Keeping a savage in your house like some kind of pet. Thomas would be spinning in his grave." "Don't you dare speak for my dead husband," Sarah shot back, her green eyes flashing dangerously. Thomas believed in justice, not vengeance. There's a difference, but the pressure was mounting, and Sarah could see the worry etched in the faces of her ranch hands. Jake Patterson pulled her aside after the ranchers left, his expression grave. "Mrs. Sarah, I've been loyal to this ranch since before you and Thomas arrived, but the boys are getting spooked. Half the territory thinks you've lost your mind, and the other half thinks you're in league with hostiles. Either way, it's dangerous for all of us." Sarah understood their concerns, but she also understood something they couldn't, that Aiakos had become more than a patient or prisoner. He'd become the companion she'd never expected to find, someone who understood loss and survival in ways her neighbors never could. Their conversations had grown intimate and intense, ranging from philosophy to poetry. Aiakos possessed a startling knowledge of literature, having learned to read from a missionary teacher during his brief childhood captivity. He could quote Hamlet and discuss the writings of Emerson with equal facility, revealing depth that shattered every stereotype about Apache intelligence and culture. "You read Shakespeare?" Sarah had asked in amazement during one of their evening talks. "The missionary believed that English words would civilize us," Aiakos replied with dry humor. "He did not expect us to find our own meanings in those words. When Hamlet speaks of being bound in a nutshell and counting himself king of infinite space, were it not that he has bad dreams? I understand this completely." One evening, as summer storms gathered over the distant mountains, their careful emotional boundaries finally crumbled completely. Sarah had been changing his bandages, noting with mixed feelings that his wounds were healing rapidly. Soon he would be strong enough to leave, and the thought filled her with unexpected grief. "You'll be able to travel soon," she said quietly, trying to keep her voice neutral. "Yes," he agreed, watching her face carefully. "Do you want me to go?" The honest answer terrified her, but she'd never been one for comfortable lies. "No," she whispered. "God help me, no." Aiakos reached up, his strong fingers gently touching her cheek. "Then I will stay, if you'll have me. Not as patient or prisoner, but as man who loves woman who saved his life and showed him that enemies can become family." When she leaned into his touch, all pretense fell away. Their first kiss was tentative, then passionate, filled with weeks of suppressed longing and the desperate knowledge that their love was impossible, by every standard their respective societies held sacred. Yet in that moment, nothing else mattered except the connection they'd forged from understanding and genuine care. "This will destroy us both," Sarah breathed against his lips. "Then we will burn together," Aiakos replied, pulling her closer. "But we will burn as one flame, not two separate shadows." The following week brought their greatest challenge yet. Captain Morrison returned with a full patrol and a grim ultimatum. Reports had reached military headquarters that Sarah was harboring not just a prisoner, but a lover, accusations that could result in her arrest for treason and collaboration with enemy forces. "Mrs. McKenna, I'm under orders to remove the Apache from your custody," Morrison announced, his voice brooking no argument. "Dead or alive, he's coming with us." Sarah stood in her doorway, blocking their path with her small frame but enormous determination. Behind her, Aiakos had risen from bed for the first time in weeks, weak but standing proud despite his obvious pain. "You have no authority here, Captain," Sarah declared. "This is private property, and he's committed no crime while under my care. The crime was committed long before he arrived here, ma'am, and now there are additional charges: corrupting a white woman, violating territorial laws against miscegenation, and inciting unrest among the civilian population." Jake Patterson and the ranch hands stood in the courtyard, torn between loyalty to Sarah and fear of military reprisal. The tension was explosive, one spark away from violence that could destroy everything Sarah had built. It was Aiakos who stepped forward, his hand finding Sarah's and squeezing gently. "I will go with them," he said quietly, his English clear and dignified, "but not as prisoner, as man who chooses to protect woman he loves from consequences of his presence." "No," Sarah said fiercely, turning to face him. "I won't let them take you to hang for the crime of being loved, and I will not let them destroy you for the crime of loving," he replied, his dark eyes holding hers with infinite tenderness. "This is not ending, Sarah McKenna. This is beginning of different story, one we will write ourselves, away from those who cannot understand." Morrison shifted impatiently. "Enough of this romantic nonsense. Apache, you're coming with us, and Mrs. McKenna, you'll face a military tribunal for your actions." But Aiakos had spent weeks studying the ranch layout, and his warrior instincts hadn't dulled with recovery. In one fluid motion, he grabbed Sarah's rifle from beside the door and stepped backward into the house, pulling her with him. "Different plan, Captain," he called out, his voice carrying new strength and old authority. "Eagle has healed his wings. Now he flies." What followed was the most daring escape in territorial history, as Aiakos and Sarah disappeared into the maze of canyons and hidden valleys that only a lifetime of desert survival could navigate. Their love story was about to become a legend, written not in parlors and churches, but in the unforgiving beauty of the Arizona wilderness, where hearts could be free even when bodies were hunted. Love had indeed made them both outlaws, but as they rode toward an uncertain future, they carried something worth any risk, a connection that transcended every boundary society had tried to impose between them. The hidden canyon Aiakos led them to was a secret known only to his people, a place where ancient springs fed emerald pools and towering red walls provided shelter from both storms and pursuit. For 3 weeks, they lived like the first inhabitants of Eden, learning to love without the weight of civilization's disapproval crushing down upon them. Sarah discovered that Aiakos possessed survival skills that transformed the harsh desert into a garden of plenty. He showed her which cactus fruits were sweetest, how to find water by reading the flight patterns of birds, and where hidden caves contained pictographs painted by his ancestors generations before white men ever dreamed of this land. "Your people have been here for centuries," Sarah mused one evening as they sat beside a crackling fire, watching stars emerge in the vast Arizona sky. "Thousands of years," Aiakos corrected, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "This land is in our blood, as much a part of us as breath or heartbeat, but now," he gestured toward the canyon walls that both protected and imprisoned them. "Now we are strangers in our own home, hiding like deer from hunters." The reality of their situation couldn't be ignored indefinitely. They were fugitives with no legal standing, no legitimate claim to safety anywhere in the territory. Morrison's patrols searched for them relentlessly, while bounty hunters, drawn by military rewards, scoured every settlement and water source. Their love had made them enemies of both cultures, too Indian for white society, too white for Apache acceptance. The solution came from an unexpected source. Jake Patterson arrived at their canyon hideout alone, unarmed, and bearing news that changed everything. He'd tracked them using skills learned from childhood friends among the Navajo, following signs so subtle that even experienced Apache scouts had missed it. "Mrs. Sarah," he said, dismounting slowly to show his peaceful intentions, "I've got information you need to hear." Sarah tensed, her hand moving instinctively to the pistol at her hip, but Aiakos placed a calming hand on her arm. His warrior instincts read no deception in the old foreman's manner. "Speak your piece, Jake," Sarah said carefully. "There's been developments back east. President Arthur signed the Dawes Act, and territorial authorities are under pressure to find peaceful solutions to the Indian question. More importantly, your cousin Margaret has been writing letters to newspapers in Denver and San Francisco, telling your story as a tale of Christian compassion and frontier courage." Sarah stared at him in amazement. Margaret, Thomas's sister who lived in California, had always been the family rebel, supporting women's suffrage and writing essays about social justice. "What exactly are you saying, Jake?" "I'm saying public opinion is shifting. Folks back east are tired of Indian wars, and some are starting to see your actions as noble rather than treasonous. More to the point, there's talk of amnesty for Indians who agree to live peacefully on designated lands." Aiakos spoke for the first time, his voice carefully neutral. "And what would be required of this Apache to earn such amnesty?" Jake met his eyes directly, man to man. "You'd have to formally renounce raiding, agree to live under territorial law, and—" he paused, understanding the significance of his next words— "marry the woman you've been living with, making your relationship legal in the eyes of white law." The silence that followed was broken only by the crackling of mesquite wood and the distant call of a nightbird. Sarah felt her heart racing as the implications sank in. It seemed impossible, too good to be true after weeks of hopelessness. "There would be conditions," Jake continued. "You'd have to settle somewhere far from the main settlements, keep your heads down, and accept that many folks will never approve. But you'd be legal, legitimate, and free to build a life together." 6 months later, in a small ceremony attended only by Jake Patterson, Dr. Hartwell, and Margaret McKenna Williams, who had traveled from California for the occasion, Sarah Elizabeth McKenna became Mrs. Sarah Aiakos in the first legal marriage between a white woman and Apache man in Arizona territory. They built their new home in the shadow of the Dragoon Mountains, far enough from civilization to avoid daily prejudice, but close enough to trade cattle and horses for supplies. The ranch was smaller than Sarah's original spread, but it was theirs, a place where their love could grow without fear or hiding. Aiakos proved to be an exceptional rancher, combining Apache knowledge of animal behavior with newfound understanding of white farming techniques. His ability to communicate with horses bordered on supernatural, and word spread among neighboring ranchers that the McKenna-Aiakos spread raised the finest mounts in the territory. Sarah learned Apache customs and language, finding beauty in traditions that white society had dismissed as savage. She discovered that Aiakos's people possessed sophisticated knowledge of medicine, astronomy, and agriculture that rivaled anything taught in Eastern universities. Their first child was born on a clear spring morning, 2 years after their wedding, a daughter with her mother's green eyes and her father's dark hair. They named her Elena Aiakos, bright light soaring, and she became the symbol of their belief that love could bridge any divide. "She will grow up in 2 worlds, Aiakos said, holding his infant daughter as Sarah rested after the difficult birth. "White world and Apache world, she will be stronger for understanding both. And she'll never have to choose between them," Sarah added, reaching out to touch their baby's tiny hand. "She'll know that love makes us family, not blood or race or the opinions of people who don't matter." As their daughter grew, so did acceptance of their unusual family. The next generation of territorial children played with Elena without seeing differences that had seemed insurmountable to their parents. Slowly, carefully, change came to Arizona territory, not through violence or legislation, but through the simple power of 2 people who had chosen love over fear. On their 10th wedding anniversary, as they sat on their porch watching Elena play with her younger brother Thomas Aiakos in the yard, where roses now grew alongside desert wildflowers, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked her husband. "Giving up the warrior's path to become a rancher and father?" Aiakos smiled, his face showing the weathering of years spent under the Arizona sun, but his eyes still holding the same depth that had first captured her attention. "The greatest warriors are those who fight for love rather than hatred," he replied. I am still fighting, Sarah McKenna, fighting every day to prove that different peoples can become one people, that enemies can become family, that understanding is stronger than prejudice. He pulled her closer, and she settled against his chest as they watched their children play in the golden light of evening. Around them, the desert bloomed with life that most people never noticed. Tiny flowers hidden among thorns, springs that sustained life in seemingly barren places, and love that had grown strong in the most unlikely soil. Besides, Aiakos added with the humor she'd learned to cherish, I am still eagle soaring. I simply learned that the highest flight is not achieved alone, but wing to wing with the one who makes your heart complete. Their love story had become legend throughout the territory, not as a tale of scandal and forbidden passion, but as proof that the human heart recognizes no boundaries save those it chooses to accept. In a land where cultures clashed and blood had soaked the earth for generations, Sarah and Aiakos had written a different ending, one word at a time, one day at a time, one act of love at a time.